Hi everybody, my name is Tim Roach. I'm the Vice Principal of Grenicker's Primary Academy here in Oldham. Um, I was at the first Brew Ed at Cleethorpes back in January 2020. The last time I got together in a room with a bunch of teachers from different schools, like Kerry, Teacher Glitter, obviously Jake and Louise, meeting people like Clive Hill, Jade, Alistair. It was a great time, great day, and nothing could have made us then realize what we were about to experience in 2020. So coming back to Brew Ed Cleethorpes, although remotely, I thought I'd talk about COVID and its effect and the way we have kind of dealt with that here in primary, as long with changes we're making in the primary curriculum. Obviously, primary curriculum is a big buzzword at the moment, and so all schools are kind of navel gazing their own curriculum and making changes and seeing how they can improve. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. You may well have seen some headlines like this in the autumn in the Mail on Sunday about children being 22 months behind, nearly 2 years in their writing, or even in the Guardian, shocking decline in pupils' attainment after lockdown. And these articles like this and other pieces of opinion writing from certain commentators seemed like they were really pushing the agenda that schools shouldn't close again. In fact, the Prime Minister came out just recently, just before he closed schools again, and said the one thing he regretted doing in lockdown one was not closing primary schools. Not quite sure how he thinks primary teachers would think about that, but here we are. By the way, this is week one of the spring term. It's January the 8th as I'm recording this. I've just closed the school on Friday, so all the children have gone home. I think I'm the last person here, lock up, well, after I record this for the third time. And we've got about a third of our children back in, based on being vulnerable children or key workers. And obviously we're trying to teach remotely at the same time. So that's quite a challenge. Yeah, not quite sure how it's a very different lockdown to the original lockdown. But obviously when we look at the newspapers, some of the things that the teachers are getting was a lot of criticism for us wanting schools closed rather than our unions or our employers looking out for our safety. Some of the ways they'd argue against that about the effect. Won't someone think of the poor children, specifically the poor children, the disadvantaged children that we now hear about a lot all of a sudden. Looking deeper in the Mail on Sunday's article, it looked at assessment of year 7 pupils when they went back to school went to their new secondary school, and they assessed their writing and found that somehow they found that they were 22 months behind. And this is based on quite a large study, based on nearly 100,000 pupils across hundreds of schools. It was actually based on a No More Marking study. No More Marking is a company that run comparative judgment software. So they run it for primary writing and through Key Stage 3 into A-level for GCSE tests and science. I don't know if they do maths yet, but specifically writing, things that are quite difficult to judge. And it works with 2 bits of writing on screen at the same time. It could be any pupil, it could be a pupil in your school, or usually it's pupils in your school and pupils in all the other schools that have been involved in this one. I think it was, if there's 9,000 teachers involved, and you can see from the right hand side there, 674 secondary schools. So all these teachers will assess different bits of writing just by looking at 2 of them on either side of the screen and clicking on the one they think is best. And then when thousands and thousands of these judgments are put together and run through the No More Marking algorithm, it comes out with the results of like a hierarchy of children. You can see who's done better, who's done significantly better, who's done worse, who's average. And then No More Marking have done some data on that, where they've kind of looked at the general percentages that might be achieving highly or achieving working towards, and put that onto the results. there's a blog written by Daisy Christodoulou, who works for No More Marking there, which goes into how they achieved this figure of 22 months. Basically, how they did it was they had all these assessments from these different year groups. Now, the year 1 to the year 6 are actually different cohorts, and they all did this assessment last year. So the final one to do it, I think, was year 6, and they probably did it at the beginning of March. And then the year 7 one is this year's year 7. So in actual fact, the year 6 and the year 7 are the same children, which is where this 22-month thing comes from, because they did an assessment, they did a piece of writing in March, just before lockdown, that was assessed, and then they did one in October or September when they returned at secondary school, and that was assessed, and that's how they get this drop here. You can see the progression, that it does go up generally. There's a bit of a pattern here. There is a rise here from year 2, which you might think, is that because year 2 is an assessment year, and maybe that's why the year 2s have achieved so much higher. They've been pushed a little bit more by their teachers, because obviously it's the end of Key Stage 1. But that's where this figure of 22 months came from. Having looked at some of the writing in our school, I don't think children write as much as they probably would have done if they hadn't had lockdown yet. But the way they've returned to writing has been quite impressive. So that figure did stand out for me as being quite unusual. And it's just one year group. It's interesting. It's a transition, just as you have a transition from year 2 to year 3, not as big a rise there. And these are different year groups, by the way. You also have a transition from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. And this particular year 7s, I mean, they've finished basically Key Stage 2 in the middle of March and hadn't been to school since about September. So imagine they might be a little bit rusty. So is this a summer delay perhaps, or a summer holiday plus lockdown drop, or are there other reasons? In maths, a company called Rising Stars did some tests. They do the Puma tests, and they do various other tests you might use in your school. And they looked at some data they had, which showed a terrible decline in maths in primary children after lockdown, based on a test that children were given to in the autumn term. Now, Solomon Kingsnorth, you might know him from Twitter. He's a primary teacher who writes some brilliant blogs on Medium. He kind of dug into the data on this and some other data as well. And he found that year 4 pupils dropped 20% in the geometry section of their maths test compared with previous year groups. He also found that year 3 pupils dropped 20% in their fractions tests. These were the biggest kind of particular drops he could find in all the data. So he thought that was significant. So he then looked at the tests themselves and saw that the year 4 one equated to a drop of 1 mark. Because there's not really that many marks in geometry in a maths test. Geometry is usually taught at the end of a year in primary, usually. The pupils who did this, the year 4 pupils, obviously they were in year 3 at the time. And so they kind of missed all their geometry. In fact, I remember teaching some geometry online on Google Classroom using White Rose remotely. But it was remotely, and it wasn't to all my pupils because they didn't all engage. And they didn't have me with them. So yeah, that's kind of understandable why that might happen. Fractions. This 20% drop equates to just 0.4 marks of the fraction section. So it's not actually that much. It might look big when you make it into a percentage, but it isn't really in the great scheme of things. And remember, these were year 2s, and they would have missed probably a lot of work, if all on fractions, which is a really difficult concept, especially for year 2s to grasp. And they would have probably missed all of that actual in-class teaching at all. So this shocking decline in people's attainment is really just based on a few things that have kind of cherry-picked or have made the effect of the test look a lot worse than actually it might have been. That's the link, by the way, to Solomon's blog, which is about the catch-up fund in general and this kind of data. So some lessons in our school that we learned from lockdown one. The younger the child, the more difficult it was to teach them remotely, and the more difficult return they had to the classroom. Some of them, I don't want to say immature because they've missed out so much and they're quite young, but particularly if they're in reception, they might have missed much of their nursery time. If they're in year one, they missed a third of their time in reception. So if they're in year two, they missed a third of their time in year one, acclimatizing to the real kind of classroom environment. Some did come back in June, and they seemed much better adjusted, as you would kind of expect, and formed great relationships with their future teacher while they were here. Physical things like handwriting suffered greatly. It wasn't. Children haven't really got the equipment necessarily, or the place at home, or the teacher stood over them trying to get them to form the letters correctly, or to join up as we would in school. So obviously that did suffer. Now, we did expect reading and writing to suffer a lot because children didn't have access to any books apart from any books they had at home, and we know that lots of children don't own any books in the home. And obviously writing is probably the most difficult thing we teach, and the only writing we were trying to do was, some children were writing things on paper, but most of them were writing and typing on Google Classroom and on Google Docs, and that wasn't great from what I saw. So we did worry about that, but we know now that actually children are kind of thriving in those environments. They're loving having things read to them. They're loving having the teacher talk about the writing, seeing the writing up on screen. And even now, we've just gone back into lockdown again. My year 6 teacher just showed me this morning some writing that someone on his remote learning class had done, and someone in class, the class he's got, still have done. And it's phenomenal how well they're doing. They're really kind of rising to the occasion. On behaviour, children were quite egocentric, so a lot of time's been wasted on behaviour, on low-level behaviour, because children are just not used to being in a classroom of so many people and sharing the adult's attention. In fact, again, I was commenting with a few teachers just this morning that now we're in much smaller bubbles of between 10 and 20 children, with children learning on remotely. It's suddenly much easier. It's much nicer atmosphere, which is really nice. So obviously we did some assessments last year, and we found that maths suffered the most. It was quite surprising considering how much we invested in maths in this school, and how kind of scientific that's been, and how really focused and our schemes of work have been. We used White Rose and Power Maths, and we thought it was best taught when we were doing it remotely. We thought that was a real win for us. But in fact, it appeared to suffer the most. And looking back at that thing that Solomon Kingsnorth wrote, I wonder if that's why, because the assessments we used, maybe they're not actually assessing the right thing. They're all right for assessing arithmetic and some reasoning, but lots of the scores in the tests are based on things that children are really, really rusty with, because they haven't been taught it in a classroom and haven't really practiced it, because we haven't gone over that bit, because we're still kind of so obsessed on basic things like number and calculations and arithmetic. However, also, children have made much more rapid gains in autumn, as they always do, but a lot of them have got back to where they should have been or thereabouts. So the lockdown effect seems to have been, regained a little bit. Now we've gone back into lockdown again. I think most teachers around the country will agree that they've improved with the way they teach remotely and try to juggle this remote learning. And if there's children in your class in primary, that's quite difficult. But we've all improved our skills massively, and hopefully we can lessen any impact of that. Another way that we worry about when we came back was, well, how do we fill in all these gaps then? These geometry things, these fraction things, the science units they've not done, the history they've not learned about. They might have missed the Romans completely if they're in a year group who studied that in the summer term. And now they moved to another year group who's got a whole new curriculum. Well, how do we fill those gaps in? Because those gaps seem massive. And obviously curriculum being such a big buzzword, and often inspectors coming in and talking to children and asking them questions about what they remember who from their long-term memory to show that learning has happened. We kind of really worry about that. How are we going to be able to account for that and make up for that? And it brought me back to something that Tim Oates said, and Tim Oates was part of the Cambridge Assessment Review, who looked at assessment before the current national curriculum was revamped, rewritten. And one of the things he famously said was fewer things in greater depth. I think Mary Myatt has used that for a title of her current book. And yeah, I agree massively. Doing fewer things and doing them in greater depth. That's why we call the highest achievement that children can do in writing greater depth. They can still do all the things that everyone else can do, but they just do it just so much better. They know so many more tricks. They have much more stylistic routes they can go down. And I think a lot of us would agree with that and think, yes, that's what we want to do. We want to strip out the things that aren't necessarily important or as important, and really get children to know well the things that are important. But does the national curriculum do that? Certainly with the 80 odd pages of English grammar in the primary national curriculum, that's not fewer things. And is it really going to be able to get children to achieve greater depth or get them to understand all these things in greater depth? Because there's a hell of a lot of things in that national curriculum. So not just in the curriculum, but specifically in grammar, when the grammar, punctuation and spelling test, or the SPAG test as people often call it, when the government finally decided to relieve us of that for this year, they decided in December to do that, I was made up. I love teaching grammar. I love teaching different types of punctuation. I love teaching writing. This test, though, I just despise because it's all out of context. Every single question is unrelated to the previous question. The children, all they have to do is English skills. Well, that's what it tests. It tests their spelling. If they can spell, they can probably pass this test. And it just tests their knowledge of grammar and punctuation. It doesn't really test it in any kind of fluent and rightly or artistic way at all. And it really is a dull test. So I'm glad not to have that ahead of our year sixes. And then this week, the Prime Minister or the Education Secretary finally revealed that there wouldn't be any SATs tests. So lots of teachers are happy about this. Not just because year six is a SATs factory, because I don't think that's the case anymore in lots and lots of schools. I think it used to be when I first started teaching, it definitely was. But that removal has maybe made it a little bit easier for us to focus on which are the fewer things that we are going to do in greater depth, which are the things that do matter more. English and maths do matter, of course they do, but having those tests ahead of those children who'd missed almost half of year 5, and now missing more of year 6, and will probably miss some if they'd been self-isolating, individual children had. It's just not fair. So that removal is the right decision. Now in school this is a really rough picture. I'm really sorry about the quality of this picture. It's because it's a photograph I took with my phone of a thing I'd made. But we did a project about the principles of instruction. So we were trying to get elements of feedback back into class, elements of retrieval practice, trying to improve our explanation and modeling, trying to have lots of guided practice and independent practice, and then making sure there's a review of the lesson at the end. And we were making headway with this, and now we've come to a period where we're teaching remotely. This is still a kind of touchstone for us in terms of how we're going to plan those lessons. We're making lots more video lessons to review things and to give children whole class feedback. But this was something that we were moving towards in all lessons. And how are we going to get this remembering better? How are we going to get this retrieval practice better in all lessons? And I don't just mean English and maths, I mean in science and history and geography and RE. One of the things we had was something like this for retrieval practice, like a simple do now. This is a science one, and this is maybe a way that we can fill some of those gaps in by referring to some of the things they should have done last year or they should have done last term, which they didn't do. We can build them in here, because if we put more and more into our curriculum to make up for the things they've missed, it would just be a bit more superficial, and that's not what we want at all. So speaking of superficial, here's a typical primary timetable, sorry. I think this is my timetable from last year when I taught year 3. And you can see it's quite busy. We watch Newsround every day to get them some current affairs, but we have handwriting, we have maths problems, we have a bit of reading, we have a bit of writing, maths lesson. So the mornings are mainly taken up by that. So then we're filling in the rest of the afternoon with all the rest of the primary curriculum, the stuff that children really enjoy the most, the ones who love science, the ones who get really into art, the children who come alive in PE, the children who are passionate about RE, the children who need the PSHE, and things like geography and history, more academic subjects, and obviously we have to do French in Key Stage 2. Things like music, these things are so important, but look how crammed this afternoon is. Now, I know when I look at my son's year 9 timetable, it's even more crazy because he's doing so many more subjects, but he's being taught by subject specialists, and it's on like a 2-week rota or 3-week rota or whatever. So it seems a bit more that the things they're being taught in these subjects are being taught with real experts in the classroom. And honestly, primary teachers are generalists, and we are schooled so much in reading and writing and maths, so that something in the afternoon just is never going to be as good across the whole of the curriculum as lessons in the morning. Certainly that's my experience anyway. And so we kind of thought many ways of how do we improve on this curriculum, because it's just so cluttered, there's just so much going on. One idea we had, and we were about to do this just before lockdown 1, was to block out large areas of the curriculum, large areas of the foundation curriculum. So we have actually gone ahead with this, and this is how the autumn term did work out for our school. So in week 1, when they came back, we didn't have a particular focus there, but they would have done various things. But we would have then continued with the curriculum for that year group in these weeks. So week 2 in year 1 would have been a science week. For these 3 weeks here, this would have been a geography period to get all the geography done for that half term, just in those 3 weeks. Art would have been done just in that week. So usually in primary, geography and history are kind of done vice versa across half terms. Art and DT the same. Science usually done every week. And things like music, RE, PSHE, PE, all the things are taught. But we wanted to make these particular subjects, these more academic subjects, these subjects that require a lot of hard work and not performance, but a lot of effort, maybe in an art room or a DT room, to really focus on that. Also during this week, there would have been a computing teacher coming in to teach the computing to the class weekly. So that's why computing does not appear on there. History and geography, we felt they're quite big, chunky topics, so we were going to give a few more weeks to those. Obviously, you can see over the whole of the half term, science has the lion's share of time spent on it. It really is a core subject. But the reason for these 1 week art and DT periods is that the children would devote the afternoons, or most of the afternoons, to those subjects, and to come up with an outcome which, if they were packing away their things after the end of every lesson, and then a week later getting everything out again, and doing a little bit of work, we just felt maybe was not conducive, and this might be an experiment to see if a different way would work. And I must stress, this is an experiment. We will evaluate this and see whether it's worked or not. But this is what we've done this year. Obviously, we've reached a period of lockdown, which forced us to change our ideas a little bit. But if we move on between year 3 and 4, see, they won't have a computing teacher in the autumn term, so they've got a whole week where they're doing their computing, as will 5 and 6. And we're lucky to have a room in this school that's like an art room and a DT room. So all the art and the DT are offset against different year groups. So that room would be devoted to that class, but they'll be able to leave everything out. You don't have to clean everything up at the end and put everything away and file everything away. That's a lot of time which will be saved. This is the effect on my year 5 class currently. So we would have started with computing, and I put a bit more detail on here. We produced some Andy Warhol prints during that week, which are on display. I wish I could show you them on the display in the corridor next to me. We really got into this mountain topic in geography. Then a bit of science, then a Victorians thing. Our history subject leader looked at these and did these chronologically, this English history thread throughout the year. Obviously, we got up to here, and we've had one day on this. I started my computing week on Monday in class, and that's all gone by the wayside for now. So we've had to have a rethink about that. And what we started to do is, because we've got the children that are in particular bubbles, 2 year group bubbles, so we're going to have to try and amalgamate the lessons for their year group. They'll have some online learning from their teacher that's set, but while they're in a class together, we think there's some things they can do together. But then there's the children still at home. So this half term is spoiled, and I was really looking forward to teaching Annie Kenny, who's a bit of an Oldham suffragette hero. But we'll have to see what we do about that, because we have to rethink this again and see what important things we've missed and how we can cover those again. But this is an experiment in arranging the curriculum, because it's so busy in primary schools, and we wanted to see whether this would make things easier for the teachers, because they're not swapping and changing several times each afternoon to cover lessons and get things in books and get children learning about things, and some of that learning is a little bit superficial. So this is my new timetable, or it was for autumn. So we've still obviously got the focus of English and maths in the morning, and we did think some things are really important to keep in the afternoon. So French we use Language Angels, which is a great online resource for French. So that's kept in the afternoon. My class goes swimming on Mondays, which is why I do a bit of maths in the afternoon, so I don't miss that. RE and PSH are taught together, and we do need obviously 2 PE lessons a week, one with the swimming. And music. We didn't think a week of music would be conducive to children really getting into music and practicing and coming back to something. So, which meant these afternoons in general, these whole long afternoons, are able to be devoted to that one subject. And like any kind of experiment, we are finding things a little bit difficult. So some year groups have struggled a little bit to finish maybe their DT or their art. Some have got to the end of their geography unit or before the end of the week or the end of the time allotted to that. I was personally a bit worried about science, but having looked at all the science books, it looks like the teachers are really doing well with that. So I've got a picture here. We have a focus on high quality written work in their books. This is from a year 6 one, but in their biology thing. And we wanted to make it very special. You see lots of these on Twitter, lots of double page spreads, because they do look impressive. But at the same time, it's not just a Twitter piece of work. It's a piece of work that the children really get engaged with and really become proud of, and it does help them to understand what they're learning. So I was worried that maybe this wasn't the best thing for science, but I just wanted to show you how much work one girl has produced in a science. So this is from September, and this is her biology book, and it includes, every so often you see a do now. So it's trying to fill in some of the things that she's missed out on in the past. There's lots and lots of writing. There's some retrieval practice up there. There's some data handling. There's diagramming. and then we've gone to electricity. So again, there's lots of retrieval practice and practical work and diagram making, and that was up to the middle of November. So when I did look at that, I did think, you know what, it's not so bad. I think we've done two of those. I think we've done okay. I think we've done all right. That concludes my talk on primary curriculum in the time of COVID. I hope there's something there you might find relevant. I was going to talk a lot about the blocked plans and show lots of pictures of books, but unfortunately this week has just changed everything. And again, we find ourselves back to square one in a situation which, but we've been here before and we came through that. And so there is, although we kind of felt resigned to what was happening, I think a lot of teachers have learned so much in 2020 that they're approaching this lockdown very differently to last time. And so we need to do the best for these children, and we understand that they will miss things out in the class. But even today, I went into a year 4 classroom and watched part live lesson with the children who were learning remotely with their tablets at home, which we've lent out. And then the children are coming in who are in school, were joining in the same lesson. And it really was quite magical. And I think we've come a long way from January last year when I talked just about writing. So thank you everyone for sitting through this. I hope there's something you can get from that. If you want to ask me any questions, my Twitter address is at the bottom. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Brewed Cleethorpes. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.